What is happening, team? It's your host, Coach Ishak with HawkFit Coaching and Legion Athletics, and I'm joined today by Chris Barakat from Tampa University. If you're unfamiliar with Chris, not only is he a adjacent, is that what it's adjunct
Adjunct.
adjunct. What is the difference between an adjunct and a normal professor?
So adjunct is just part-time, essentially. Um,
Part-time.
Most adjuncts, well, I shouldn't say most adjuncts. Me personally, it's not like I'm trying to pursue academia full-time. So there's associate professors, and those people are on a 10-year track, and they want to make a career out of teaching and academia. I just teach part-time, and I do a lot of research. So that's
Nice.
why I'm
Well,
there.
that's still really cool. It allows you to balance, the other things on your plate being, a coach and, you have a world champ title under your belt now, and you've played a role in, other world champs' success. And it's good to see, you're actually practicing in the field and, you're investigating a lot of these questions people have or a lot of these quote unquote bro science methods, which, to this day, people still try to argue about them, but we know that depending on the context and there's an appropriate, validity in certain approaches.
Mhm.
And for the basis of this episode, team, we will be talking about optimizing, which is always going to be different from person to person, but your peak week strategy. So a lot of times people try to throw a Hail Mary at a peak week, thinking it's going to induce massive changes in the cosmetic side of things, when the reality is most of the work that has to be done with regards to a contest prep has to be done for before you get to peak week. So think of it like baking a cake, right? The basic cake component doesn't change. However, what peak week essentially allows you to do is just add icing and those fine details to the cake, which could bring out the flavor that much more. Can you tell that I'm dieting? And so a couple things peak week is not for is losing more body fat percent, shedding quote unquote water and thinning your skin, eating all the tilapia, stressing out. And, there are obviously certain changes we would have to make with regards to, training. So, Chris, I'm going to let you take the floor. What are some common mistakes many people tend to make when it comes to their peak week strategy?
Man, there's a lot of mistakes, but I'm going to take a slightly different approach based on what people may have heard from other people in the space, other common issues that have been reported with peak week. I'm going to start it off by saying I actually think a lot of people undereat during peak week and come in still relatively flat or not as full as they actually could be. I think after dieting for 16 to 20 to 24 weeks, a lot of people have a fear of food to a certain extent. And from what I've seen, I think a lot of people, yeah, they can miss the mark due to a lot of the other variables that they manipulated. But I just think a lot of people actually come in flat, not as full as they could be. And that's because they're scared to eat as much food as required to properly fill out. So kind of want to start off with that because I know it's probably a little bit different than what most people would talk about right off the bat. Most of the time you hear people make mistakes manipulating water, they cut water too soon, or maybe they throw in an herbal diuretic that they've never used before and they don't know how it's going to impact them, but they kind of just throw it in last minute to see what happens. So they might do a lot of things that haven't been previously calculated, which absolutely can throw off their look. But I think, again, one of the things that a lot of people could probably get a better benefit from is properly filling out and truly maximizing glycogen stores rather than, maybe being 50% full or 60% full on stage.
Great points, great points. And I loved how you said some people may be scared of food, which is an important point, especially if you've been dieting for months and months on end. I know a great paper from Eric Helms that you're probably familiar with is evidence-based recommendations for a natural bodybuilder. And they actually listed some of the negative effects that occur as a result of going through a contest prep, potential exacerbation of eating disorders and a greater degree of body dysmorphia. And that could, lead to the fear of people, just keeping food really low and not properly filling out their physique. So that's a great point. And before we progress with this conversation, guys, we're speaking about the sport of competitive bodybuilding. So when you do any sport at a high level, there are going to be extremes that you sort of have to push through. And especially in the context of, competition level today, getting to the level of conditioning that's required to be competitive on today's stage is not the most, healthiest of things. And although it's not super healthy, our goal as coaches is to do it in the healthiest manner possible. And so with regards to kind of obtaining data for a peak week strategy, something that I like to do with my clients is, once we get a little bit leaner, because most times it's generally better to be ahead of conditioning. So you could use those final weeks to kind of play around with a few refeeds, see how that influences things. And, you could kind of gauge from that baseline data what you need to do to optimize a peak week strategy. So I'll let you take the floor. What are some things, or how could people, go about, getting that baseline data?
Yeah, so there's a few things that you can do. I actually think a lot of the formulas that we know through the scientific literature in regards to how much carbohydrate is required to fill out glycogen is pretty darn solid. A lot of the literature shows you're probably going to need anywhere from 8 grams to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of total body weight. So just starting there is a really good place to start. So if you ever were in a contest prep phase, you can kind of run a mock peak week or just take a super, super aggressive refeed and see how that makes you feel and makes you look. Because there are certain subjective kind of biofeedback mechanisms that you'll experience while you're truly filling out muscle glycogen. So some things related to that would be once your muscle is so full, you're going to notice that your skin feels tighter when you're flexing because your muscle is now at a fullness that you're not used to experiencing. So you're going to just start to feel certain things. You're going to start to look differently. And then it's important to kind of see, all right, how does my body respond to this from a weight perspective? How much weight may I gain the next morning? Does my weight actually maintain and I look leaner the next morning, even though I'm still super full? You might have stored a lot of glycogen intracellularly, but you might have lost a lot of water extracellularly. So the scale might not move as much. Some people even drop weight. So getting an idea of how your body might respond is super, super important. Just to give a really quick example, I actually want to pull up my spreadsheet from one of my first peaks this past year. I remember I ate an insane amount of carbs for that first show on a Wednesday. I started my carb load. And then the next day, I only gained like 0.2 pounds or something on the scale. I just want to quickly pull those numbers up because even I was surprised, and I have a good amount of experience with this, so someone else might really be caught off guard, but it's just, again, tools in the toolbox, and there's certain ways to manipulate things, right? So,
And this is to take advantage of glycogen synthesis or something like super compensation.
yeah, the goal here is going to be to super compensate and really maximize those stores. So really quick example so on Wednesday, during a peak week, competing on a Saturday, I weighed in at 159.2 pounds. And then I had 600 grams of carbs that day, and drank 2.5 gallons of water. And I only woke up 0.6 pounds heavier. So I was just like, damn, there's a few things that happened there. I was like, I can still fill out a lot more because my scale weight didn't go up that much. And I knew I wasn't super full. I woke up at like a 4 out of 10 fullness. And then B, I also knew that I kind of dropped some extracellular water, and there was like a nice stress reduction that happened from the carb load. But then the next day I had to continue to eat really, really high amount of carbs. I had 500 carbs. And then there comes this autoregulation process. The crazy thing is there, I actually lost 0.8 pounds and hit a new all-time prep low after 2 days of carb loading. So even though I ate, 1,100 grams of carbs in a 48-hour window, I actually hit a new low. So some people might panic if stuff like that happens, or it might really catch them off guard. So it's important to not just have the objective data like weigh-ins, but also just kind of be in tune with your body, pay attention to how things are changing visually, and then auto-regulate the rest of the peak. But we can probably go into more specific ways to actually set up your peak, depending on what the strategies are, and the reasons why in a little bit.
So before we get into more of the specificities of peaking, what are your thoughts on, because we're familiar with how to go about doing a peak week with regards to tracking things and keeping food selection more or less the same. So what are your thoughts on people who would go that route versus people who go, the other route of just having, a burger and some French fries and XYZ?
Yeah, so I think keeping food sources similar to what you've been doing while prep's really important. Again, just to take out the guesswork. If your digestive health is great, you don't have any bloating after meals, your bowel regularity is on point, and everything is just smooth sailing, you want to keep that going. The last thing you want to do is say, okay, now I have a lot more calories and a lot more carbs that I can fit in. I'm going to do that from a bunch of processed foods that maybe I didn't eat in the last 12 to 16 weeks plus. That can really throw a wrench in your GI system. And then rather than getting a good response out of this, maybe now you're bloated, maybe you're retaining a little bit more water, you're not going to the restroom as much, whatever it may be, you just don't want to take the risk, I even see, I actually did this in 2013. I was nailing my peak perfectly Monday through Friday. And then Saturday morning, I started eating a bunch of shit that I haven't had in a very long period of time. And I instantly felt like I started retaining a little bit of water, was a little bit bloated, had some stomach distress, and instantly regretted it. And I was like, well, damn, I could have just waited 8 hours until the show was done and then enjoyed myself after the show. So it was, that was a rookie mistake at 21 years old. But a lot of people still do that. There can be some times where they call it crap loading, can be beneficial, or even like it could be a necessity depending on the case. So let's just say you have an athlete that is doing like a national level show and they weigh in 24 hours before competition. They're going to be super dehydrated, super depleted going into weigh-ins. And now you only have 24 hours or less to try to fill out as much as possible. So in those situations, that can actually be a tool where it's kind of more of a necessity, because not only do you need a lot of carbs, you probably want a lot of fat as well to fill out intramuscular triglycerides, whatever it may be. So getting in a ton of calories in a short window, that's probably a case and situation to make a point for that. But otherwise, you're kind of rolling the dice and taking a gamble, and risking probably more harm than good in that situation.
Great points. Great points. So right now we've touched on carbohydrates being really important. Now we've touched on the importance of, having a, more structured peak versus a more YOLO peak. Now, okay, let's go ahead and talk about and define the different ways to approach a peak week, whether that be a backload or a rapid backload, or what's called a progressive linear load, people call it. I call it a front load. There's so many different terms. So let's
Sure.
go ahead and define that for the audience.
Yeah, so we'll start with some of the common practices, and then I'll kind of not finish with, but then go into a setup that I ran this past season. I've been running with some clients, and something that I actually learned from Dr. Scott Stevenson and Guillermo Escalante. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But let's start with the linear load or the front load. It can be slightly different. So a general front load will just let's just say peak week starts on Sunday or Monday. You're competing on Saturday. A front load would be starting that carb up process early on in the week and then tapering it as the week goes on. So let's just theoretically say on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, maybe somebody consumes 500 carbs, 400 carbs, and 300 carbs. They kind of are starting to refill muscle glycogen, fill out, and see how their body looks. Then maybe midweek, they feel like after 3 to 4 days of front loading, they are very full. Then the last 2 or 3 days, rather than continuing to fill out, they kind of eat at theoretical maintenance and maybe they taper carbs a little bit, or they already started that taper. So it starts off really high in the beginning and then it kind of comes down as the week goes on, or once the athlete and the coach kind of realize, like, okay, maximum fullness has been achieved. Now we just want to maintain this and kind of coast into the show. So it's definitely a viable approach. A linear load can be similar, but also slightly different. So linear load, you can start your carbohydrate load early on in the week again, like Saturday or Monday, Sunday or Monday, but now you're adding carbs each day. So maybe you start at 200 and then you go to 250, then you go to 300, then you go to 350, then 400, and you keep building up. And again, until you see that the athlete has reached a really good level of fullness. They're giving you those biofeedback signals that, hey, like the pumps are insane. I can just feel my muscle is tighter against the skin. You can literally feel your muscle hanging off your bone more. So there's a lot of different sensations that the athlete can report to you. And then obviously you're seeing it in the photos that this athlete is filling out. So again, that's kind of starting low, but you're beginning to carb up and you're increasing as the week goes on. And then, maybe Thursday, Friday, you're just monitoring and seeing what happens. Um, so those are the two: front load, linear load. What was the other ones you mentioned? Rapid backload?
Rapid backload and backload.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I'll start with the rapid backload. This was made very popular by Cliff Wilson, who absolutely nails this protocol. Generally speaking, he takes an approach where like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is very, very low carb, but moderate fat, moderate protein. So it's kind of keto-esque. He tries to have the athlete around theoretical maintenance or slightly below. So he brings up fats, significantly reduces carbs, and keeps protein probably where it's been at the entire prep. The goal there is to deplete muscle glycogen and intentionally make the athlete really, really flat. And come Friday morning, the athlete generally hits their lowest weigh-in of prep because they are so depleted and they are so flat. Again, glycogen carries around 3 to 4 grams of water. So when your glycogen is depleted, you're carrying less water throughout your entire body, and therefore your entire body weight is going to be lower. So when the athlete's really flat on, Friday morning, they begin their carb up very, very aggressively in a short window. So they might do that in a 24-hour period or so. I know sometimes he has his athletes like even start maybe Thursday night at like 9 p.m. Sometimes he has them actually wake up mid-morning to eat a meal, go back to sleep. But long story short, they basically do a 24-hour rapid backload where they're super aggressive. In those cases, the athletes can consume anywhere from like 10 to 12 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight. So again, like a 70 kg bodybuilder will probably consume a minimum of 700 grams of carbs in one day, probably up to 1,200 plus grams of carbs in one day. So in that situation, your carbohydrate food source becomes way more important. You can't eat 700 grams of carbs from potato or like white rice. This is where you start drinking a lot of your carbohydrates. So he uses things like Gatorade powder. Um, I would probably use things like fruit juice in that situation. and probably things that are super easy to digest, like cream of rice and stuff like that. So food sources are going to be really important if you're doing a rapid backload because you're just trying to get down so many calories in a short period of time. So that's a rapid backload. Basically, it's a 24-hour thing. And then a traditional backload is where you still start off the week low carb, generally inducing this glycogen depletion. And then you start your carb load either Wednesday or Thursday. And again, you're just loading your carbohydrates at the end of the week going into the show.
Great points, great points.
Cool.
And so at the beginning of a peak, and or it's funny because most of the time in a contest prep, our goal is to get shredded and lose body fat and burn out or oxidize those intramuscular triglycerides. So you mentioned something about fat loading. So why don't you go ahead and fill the audience there and why that may potentially be valuable as our skeletal muscle doesn't only store glycogen.
Sure. Yeah, so intramuscular triglycerides are another energy substrate that we do utilize and we do store. From a muscle fullness standpoint, they're not nearly as important as carbohydrate and glycogen. It might make up for 1 to 3% of muscle fullness. But again, for a bodybuilder that's trying to cross every T and dot every I, 1 to 3% better could be the difference of first place or second place, whatever it may be, right? So if you're truly trying to nail it, it's definitely something to at least consider. If you are in true stage shape and you've just been dieting for a very long period of time, there is a very high likelihood that your intramuscular triglycerides are extremely depleted anyway. So again, it's just a fuel source and a fuel reserve, so to speak, that is probably running close to E and just something to consider refilling if you're trying to go into a show as full as possible. So I guess I'll dive into how I've been setting up the peaks and kind of what I've learned from Dr. Scott Stevenson and the approach that we kind of laid out as a logical and practical means to peaking in that review paper that we wrote together. So the way that works, the way that we kind of outlined things was Sunday through Tuesday, the beginning of the week. We utilize it as a time period to deplete muscle glycogen, but also potentially fill out intramuscular triglyceride, right? Refill that fuel reserve. So essentially, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. You can have fats high for 3 consecutive days and carbs low for 3 consecutive days. What I personally like doing is have fats kind of moderate on Sunday, a little bit higher on Monday, and highest on Tuesday, and carbs low all 3 days. I do think it's important that those first 2 days you're still in a slight deficit because just theoretically speaking, if you're eating at true maintenance, you're not tapping into any energy reserves because you have enough coming in through food, right? So if you truly want to deplete glycogen, I think that deficit needs to be there just to make sure that glycogen was actually utilized for energy, right? So maybe be in a slight deficit those first 2 days. On that third day, on Tuesday, I like getting closer to maintenance or in a very slight surplus where the fats are going to be higher here. And that's going to allow you to restore intramuscular triglycerides. So the literature shows if you were to do this just in one day, you would need around 2 grams of fat per kilogram of body weight. So again, for like a 70 kg person, they would need 140 grams of fats. It's pretty significant. It's pretty high, and it's way higher than they're used to throughout their diet. So like a practical way to approach it would be doing 75 grams on Sunday, maybe 90 to 110 grams on Monday, and then maybe 125 to 140 on Tuesday, right? And then the carbs are super low, and the protein is probably similar to what you've been doing all prep, but it's going to depend for each individual. And then in that case, you just had 3 days of carb depleting. Wednesday morning, if you did that, you would probably hit a prep low, Water's pretty high. Again, glycogen's depleted. So you're holding less total body water. And that's why your scale weight oftentimes is below it has been all prep. Then on Wednesday morning, once you hit that new low, you start to carb up. So the way we lay it out is we're carb loading for 2 days really aggressively, Wednesday and Thursday really aggressively. And if you do it properly, the goal is actually to kind of spill on Thursday night. So you want to be so full on Thursday night, you want to be like an 11 out of 10 full, that the carbohydrates that you ate can no longer be stored as glycogen because that gas tank is full. And now that glucose has spilt over into the extracellular compartments, and now you look smoother. So now the definition in between your muscles, the muscle separation's down, the striations aren't as visible. So, on a Thursday night, you're not stepping on stage, so you're fine, but at least you know you're full. Like you're posing and you feel like your muscles are going to pop out of your skin, but you look blurry and you're not nearly as crisp and as detailed. The cool thing is we still have more than 24 hours to kind of clean stuff up and get ready for stage. So if you carb load hard on Wednesday and Thursday and you fill and spill, you can use Friday as a day to like tighten back up, drop that body water. And I like to call it like a refinement period. This is where a lot of autoregulation is going to come into play. But you can use Friday as a day to drop that body water, decrease both carbs and calories overall. You're no longer trying to fill. You don't have to be in a surplus. You can kind of eat at theoretical maintenance, and then you kind of just cruise into the show. So yeah, that's the general approach. Another thing that's really
Many ways to roam.
Yeah, yeah. Some important caveats to running that approach is on Wednesday and Thursday when carbs are at their highest and your goal is to load and fill and spill. You need water to be super, super high, and you also want salt and sodium to be super high. You want it to be much higher than baseline, right? And then on Friday, I keep water still super high, but it's closer to what baseline was. I'll give you numbers in a minute. And then I bring sodium probably slightly above baseline, but a little bit lower than it was on Wednesday and Thursday. So I'll give you guys a quick example of some numbers just for like practical application, right? Let's just say okay, so in terms of water, let's just say you're drinking 1.5 gallons a day throughout the entire prep. You kind of keep that 1.5 gallons consistent on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday when you're doing this glycogen depletion phase. On Wednesday and Thursday, when you're carb loading, you want a pretty strong increase in water because, again, you're increasing carbs significantly, and you want to increase urine output intentionally to a certain extent. So you increase water. Let's say you were doing 1.5 gallons a day. You're probably going to do a minimum of 2 gallons, but up to 2.5, 3 gallons on Wednesday, Thursday. And then again on Friday, me personally, I keep water still relatively high, but it's a big reduction compared to what you drank the day before. So like, let's say on Thursday, I drank 3 gallons. On Friday, I might go right back to baseline of 1.5 gallons. So even though water is still high, that creates a pretty big shift in your total body water, and that does lead to more diuresis or urine output, and it probably impacts intracellular, extracellular fluid volumes as well. So it's pretty interesting. We have some case study data on that now this year. So I'm excited to share that in the very, very near future. So it's going to be really cool.
Nice, excited to see that. Important note, guys. He said increase sodium, so you're not cutting sodium. That's a very common misconception, and there are many reasons for keeping sodium high with regards to intracellular and extracellular fluid. and also getting the carbohydrates within the skeletal muscle. So something else to note is, we've been talking a lot about, carbohydrates and our peak week strategy, but one thing we haven't touched on yet is our training and how sometimes, going to the gym and training hard AF could negatively impact glycogen synthesis, could impact your peak because you're inducing some muscle damage. So why don't you go ahead and give some audience some insight there, potentially, modifications with regards to exercise selection. The
For
list goes
sure.
on.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a good thing to bring up, Coach Shaq. So we got in regards to the training, a lot of people have a misunderstanding that training automatically improves insulin sensitivity. That's not necessarily true. So exercise in general, human movement in general, can be great for insulin sensitivity and glucose uptake, but heavy, hard resistance training that creates a lot of muscle damage and micro trauma actually reduces insulin sensitivity acutely in the muscles that were actually trained and damaged. So let's just say you're training hard on Wednesday and Thursday while you're carb loading because you want those carbs to go into the muscle. If you're creating micro trauma and muscle damage, it actually is literally unable to go where you want it because now the myocyte itself is damaged and glucose can't be transported where you want it to go. So during peak week, it's important to do a couple of things. A, reduce your training intensity, and B, make sure you're not doing exercises that are very eccentric dominant or that overload a muscle in its lengthened position. So just a quick example, like an eccentric dominant movement would be something like an RDL, right? Romanian deadlift, obviously there's eccentric and a concentric, but it's more eccentric dominant. And because you're training the hamstrings in the lengthened position, you can create a ton of muscle damage from that. Another exercise that's not necessarily eccentric dominant, but it overloads the muscle in its lengthened region would be like something like a dumbbell pec fly. You probably want to avoid something like that. You'd probably be better off doing something like a machine pec deck fly, right? So you want to be smart with your exercise selection. And then this is an opportunity where you don't need to train at an RP of 7 or an RP of 10. You can literally get away with training at like an RP of 4 or an RP of 5. You can literally train super light. The goal here isn't to build muscle anymore, right? Your muscle isn't going to have a different visual aesthetic if you train hard 3 days before the show or you don't train hard 3 days before the show. Another thing to consider is you're not going to be losing any muscle if you're in a surplus, because why would muscle protein breakdown be elevated if you have plenty of calories coming in, right? So nothing to worry about there. I think a lot of people have a psychological attachment to training and their way of training. So they don't like letting off the gas pedal, especially when they're about to compete against others, right? Because from a psychological component, there's a part of it of you don't want to be outworked. You want to make sure that when you're on stage, you have no regrets. So the person standing next to you and you're kind of battling with and posing against, you don't want to feel like had a couple of chill training sessions and you let this guy sneak in and take what was yours, right? But the truth of the matter is you need to think about what's actually being judged, what is actually going to maximize your look, your aesthetic, and what is going to enable you to have the most successful peak possible. So kind of lose the ego and think logically here, utilize the scientific evidence and our understanding of what's going on to peak yourself to the best of your ability, right? So yeah, training. Honestly, I significantly reduced my training during peak week 2. If you're eating a ton of carbs, you don't necessarily have to train to push the carbs where you want it to go. Um, your body knows how to store glycogen, and our bodies are smarter than we think they are, right? We're very, very complex organisms. So you can literally just eat 1,000 grams of carbs and probably don't train at all, and you'll still be fine. Like the carb is going to go where it needs to go. So you don't have to overthink that. And then last thing I'll say is if you're doing way too much training during peak week or while you're carb loading, you're just going to require more food, and you're going to increase the likelihood that you don't maximize muscle glycogen because you're burning through that substrate rather than it being stored. So, Ishak, you want to tell them a story back in 2019 of when you might have
Oh man.
experienced something like that?
Yeah, I was just about to get to that too. I was about to bring it up. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar, my last competition season, I'm competing this year, but my last competition season was 2019. And my second show of the season, looking back now, I would have, changed my peak week strategy. I probably would have just increased food going into the show, but that could have also been a variable of me just overposing a couple of days before the show. So really promoting recovery, like Chris said, is something that's really important during a peak week. And, overposing could be something that takes away from your ability to fill out properly. So that's a great point. And do you have anything to touch on there?
Bro, give them more details. I mean, that second show of the season for you, it was a vibe. He was down here in Florida with me, and we were at the show at the hotel venue the day before, and it was good vibes. Jeff Albert was there, my boy Josh was there, uh, but Brett Freeman was there. Who else were you posing with? Uh, it was just a
Jeff
vibe.
Alberts. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. A lot of people.
So he's
Pick up bodybuilding.
posing pickup. It was pickup bodybuilding. So instead of playing pickup basketball or a game of horse, these athletes are in the hotel gym, getting butt naked basically, and posing in the mirror and taking a bunch of pictures for the gram, and they're posing for like, all right, 30 minutes go by and they chill and they put their hoodies on, and then someone else comes to the hotel and checks into the venue and they're like, oh damn, I gotta get photos with you too. All right, so another 15 minutes of posing, right? So they're flexing for a long, long period of time, and essentially they're just running through glucose substrate, tapping into their glycogen stores, or just utilizing the carbs that they have in their GI system for that fuel rather than allowing it to be stored. So then Ishak was like, "Damn!" The next morning he's like, "Damn, I'm still flat even though I ate all this food." So yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
kind of used a lot of
Food.
that.
It's very food. What happens after food hits our mouth is very different when it hits our bloodstream, right?
Yeah,
So that's a good point. And I always like to say experience is the greatest teacher. So ultimately, it's just made me a better athlete, better coach,
absolutely.
and now I have that experience to tailor how I actually approach a peak. So we've talked about carbohydrates, we've talked about water manipulation, we've talked about training, but let's go ahead and talk about cortisol and acute details within a peak that could impact that cosmetic look on show day,
Mm.
whether that be just really making sure you're actually chilling out and promoting a parasympathetic state, or some modifications you could be even making with your sleep. I know you did some feet elevation just to make sure that the legs come in extra peak. So I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting. You can run a mock peak week and literally nail your nutritional protocol down to the T. Um, but the truth is, competition week is always different than a mock because you have the travel, you have checking in, you have weighing in, you have going to a hotel venue, you have the tanning appointments, you have stuff going on with your posing trunks, whatever it may be, submitting your music, your routine. So there's automatically more task to do on competition week compared to mock peak week, and there's usually a lot of unaccounted for things that kind of just lead to acute stress that you kind of can't plan for. But the more experienced you are, it's coming and it's to be expected, and you kind of just doesn't really catch you off guard as much. But when you kind of first get started in the sport, it's like, oh damn, now I got to do this. Okay, I have the polygraph the day before for the people that are natural. That's a stressful situation in itself. Um, you, you could never touch anything your entire life, but you're still nervous about the damn poly. It is how it is for everyone. So that's a stressful thing to undergo within a 24-hour window of competing. So there's so many things that are going on, Another thing that generally happens is your step count might be way higher the day before the show compared to baseline, just because you got all this running around. You're going to the tanning, you're going to the polygraph, you're going to the check-in, the weigh-in. So many things can be going on that you might not think about the day before. So
Get a wheelchair.
yeah, my suggestion is whenever you don't have to be doing a task, don't do anything. So don't make a plan to sightsee or go on a stroll and take a walk. Do all that stuff after the show. You're going to have enough task and enough mini stressors to deal with anyway. Um, so yeah, just take it from there. And then some coaches can be quite demanding of their athletes the day before. Um, Me personally, I'm a bit more chill. I kind of trust the process. I ask for photos first thing in the morning, and then before, later on in the evening, unless the athlete is giving me feedback that something has gone wrong. But I generally trust the process really well. I know some coaches that ask their athletes for photos after every single meal or every hour. Like I can't imagine taking 12 sets of photos in one day. Like that just takes time and stress and energy.
The most I've
So
asked my athletes to do is like three sets of photos.
yeah, and I
After
can
like
totally
meal
see that.
fasted, meal two, and then at the end of the day.
Sure, absolutely. I usually ask for photos midday just to see, okay, do we need more food or less food? Are they still full? Are they still flat? Whatever it may be, right? But yeah, that's just an additional stressor. So things to think about are that. You briefly mentioned the leg elevation. So a lot of athletes might stack a bunch of pillows up under their feet and elevate their legs. The interesting thing is the proper way to actually implement this technique is called a head down tilt. So you don't just want your legs elevated and your back flat. You actually want your entire body on a slight decline. So in the literature, you actually want to be on like a 4 to 7 degree decline, and that alters your blood pressure and it actually increases diuresis. So it increases urine output. So that's a technique that you can use if you're an athlete trying to make weight for a specific weight class, or if you're just trying to lose more total body water. So again, that's something that Scott Stevenson included in that peak week review paper. He has the scientific evidence to support it.
Wow.
It's pretty cool.
Now you're
Um,
gonna get
yeah,
everyone elevating hotel beds and
yeah,
Airbnb beds to optimize their peak.
that's it, man. Head down tilt.
Head down tilt. Nice, awesome. That's something I'll for sure be implementing, even if it gives me that 1%.
There
That
you go,
one
man.
percent makes a big difference ultimately. And okay, so we've pretty much talked about optimizing a peak at this point. And something that I always love to chat with you about is the internal, external
Ooh,
component of bodybuilding and how sometimes on show day, some people are not able to realize what they've accomplished throughout the entire process simply due to the fact that they hold that external validation to a higher of importance. And it really just prevents them from, seeing what they did 6 months, 8 months, whatever, however long the prep was, the early mornings, the late nights, all of that, suddenly loses its value. So let's go ahead and give the audience some of that gray hair wisdom.
oh man, I do want to dive there, but before we get to it, I do want to touch on like 1 to 2 more components peak. Is that cool? All right.
Yeah.
So real quick, I wanted to touch on one thing that you mentioned earlier, and then talk about like what's going on physiologically, scientifically. So you did mention earlier, the very, very beginning of the show, you spoke about thinning the skin, right? Um, I find this super interesting because this past year, during my peak, we actually measured subcutaneous thickness throughout the entire peak with an ultrasound. And it's the first time it's ever been done in the literature for like acute purposes, day to day to day. Um, and so I'm going to quickly explain, obviously, why we're measuring that. subcutaneous fat is what we're losing throughout the entire contest prep, and that's what we care about as bodybuilders. So if you are super shredded and close to fat free, you're going to have thin skin regardless because you don't have a lot of subcutaneous fat. The really, really cool thing that we observed this past year was there was significant changes to the subcutaneous layer throughout the peak. So like a really quick example, Wednesday morning when I was fully carb depleted and before I carb loaded, my triceps were, X amount of thickness and my quads had X amount of subcutaneous thickness. We saw like a 42% reduction in subcutaneous thickness from Wednesday to Saturday. So 3 days out to show day morning, and we saw at least a 25% plus reduction in thickness in the quads too. And the thing that was so cool about that was I was able to see that, okay, my tricep feathering is more visible and it's more aesthetic, and my quad feathering was more visible and more aesthetic. So there actually was a change to the subcutaneous layer, which was super cool. And again, our fat cells or adipocytes, not only do they contain triglyceride, but they also contain a little bit of water. So when you're maximizing muscle glycogen, there is some theory that your body might be pulling water from the subcutaneous layer into the cell for transportation purposes of that carbohydrate, right? So it might be utilizing water from this tissue to transport a nutrient into another tissue. That's a theory there. And then another study that recently came out by Nuances and colleagues in Brazil, they looked at the intracellular to extracellular water ratio from 1 day out to show day, and they saw a massive change in intracellular to extracellular fluid shifts. We saw something not as drastic, but my intracellular fluid to extracellular fluid, that ratio was enhanced on show day compared to any other day throughout the peak week. So it does seem like the practices that bodybuilders and physique athletes do implement, it can have a positive outcome on our quote unquote body composition, as well as our body water and the fluid shifts there. So I just wanted to mention that because it's cool data, it's kind of novel data, and we still don't fully understand how and why. But going back again to your intro, these are things that might be labeled as bro science, but the truth of the matter is we just haven't had the data that observed what's going on there yet. So it's just something that there's a lack of an understanding for. It's not necessarily bro science. It's stuff that has been observed anecdotally by bodybuilders over the past, 3, 4, 5 decades, but we just don't have that objective data to explain it. Okay.
I love learning. Shout out to how do you pronounce the last name?
Nuances. Yeah, it's
Nunez. It doesn't have a Z.
Yeah, it's an S.
But shout out to him. He's crushing it. I'm gonna have him on here for an episode, and I would say he's like the Chris of Brazil.
Yeah.
He's crushing it on all fronts. So that's awesome to see. And just to keep going on that point, we talked about stress. We talked about thinning the skin, but we didn't really actually touch on the point of, use of adaptogens such as ashwagandha or use of herbal diuretics. So why don't you go ahead and touch on that?
Yeah. So with that, it's hard to say how much of an impact that might have and what kind of impact that might have. To keep things really short and sweet right now for that, I would say if you've been using herbal adaptogens throughout your prep, keep it in throughout peak week. If you haven't been using it throughout the prep, I personally wouldn't roll the dice and throw something in there that you haven't done before. You just don't know, is it going to negatively impact your sleep? Can impact your, it depends what you take, but something like rhodiola rosea can be a little bit more stimulative to somebody. So if they haven't had it all prep, maybe you're not just going to throw it in last minute. Ashwagandha generally has slightly more inhibitory properties, so it's a little bit more relaxing. But I probably wouldn't throw it in. It can be a tool in the toolbox, especially throughout the entire contest prep. So some of those herbal adaptogens have been shown to reduce cortisol levels and improve hormonal levels like testosterone, and also improve subjective um, subjective assessments related to anxiety or general well-being and mood. So definitely things to consider throughout the prep and potentially for the peak as well. And then herbal diuretics, one thing I will say is because they are so commonly used, even in the natural side, I would say they're heavily misused. So something like dandelion root has been shown to increase diuresis and urine output, but it works in a very, very acute fashion. So the data shows that it kind of works for around 12 hours. Okay, so I see a lot of people start taking something like an expel or a dandelion root maybe as early as Sunday of peak week. Maybe, yeah, or even 2 weeks out, and they're taking it for a while. Yeah. A lot of people implement it on Wednesday. You're 72 plus hours out. Um, Depending on the athlete, that might be more appropriate to use literally just the night before. You use that literally the night before when you're about 12 hours out. And that could play in your favor. It could not. Kind of depends on the athlete. You can experiment with that stuff if you do a mock peak or even during refeeds and stuff. And then lastly, I'll give not a secret away, but a good point of advice for female clients. If they still do have their cycle, depending on what category they're in or how lean they got, whatever it may be, they still have their cycle and they get their cycle on competition week or when they're going to be stepping on stage. I have utilized those herbal diuretics in those scenarios and saw tremendous benefit from them because in those cases I generally see a little bit more water retention, especially in the lower abdomen area, the waist area. So utilizing herbal diuretics in that case, I've personally seen benefits from it. So maybe for your female athletes that still have their cycle, and that happens to happen during show week, can be a tool that you kind of pull out then.
Great points, great points. And just to round that off, and just like how I started the beginning of this episode, team, nothing you do during peak week is going to be a Hail Mary and significantly impact the cosmetic side of things. The majority of the work with regards to fat loss has to be done before you get to peak weekend. But if you nail all these variables, it could influence your physique a ton. But, there are some cases where, trying to focus on XYZ and throw all these variables, especially if you're less experienced, might take away from your peak because it stresses you out so much. So this is also why having an experienced coach in your corner is also really important. And if you're unfamiliar with how to approach a peak, Chris has a great paper on it, and it actually provides you a mock peak example that you could implement. So peak week recommendations for bodybuilders and evidence-based approach, and go ahead and dive into that. And just to round off this conversation, Chris, let's go ahead and hear your thoughts on that internal, external side of bodybuilding.
Sure. And huge shout out to Dr. Guillermo Escalante for spearheading that review paper, and Scott and Alan and Dr. Schoenfeld too. So I was honestly honored and privileged to be a part of that. It was super, super cool. But yeah, let's dive into the internal, external stuff, man. I've been on both sides of the fence too. So when I was younger, especially in 2013 and a little bit 2017, I put a lot of emphasis on acquiring the external objective goal, right? Which is win the pro card, get first place. It's great. That's a great way to put fuel under the fire and be competitive and, make sure you are working your butt off every day. But the truth of the matter is we can't control a lot of external circumstances. And then when it comes to competitive bodybuilding, you don't know who's going to show up, right? So all you can do is do your best throughout the entire process, cross your T's, dot your I's, know that you're giving this your absolute best effort, and be very proud of what you bring to the stage, regardless of where the chips fall, right? A little side analogy that I'll utilize right now is I get really frustrated when I have students that bitch to me about their grades when I know they didn't give it their best effort, right? So it's like a student comes up to you, you know, you get an 85 on a test or a personal presentation, and they're like, "Professor, why did I get 85?" Or like, "Where did I lose points?" And it's like, you're lucky you got an 85 because you probably gave this like a 6.5 out of 10 effort, right? You didn't give it a 10 out of 10 effort. You probably got a 6.5 out of 10 effort. So you're lucky you didn't get a 65 because that's probably what you deserved. And they're still upset that they got the 85, right? So a stage example like that would be like, let's say you've been competing for 3 years. You've been lifting for 3 years, and you are a little bit genetically blessed, and you only dieted for 12 weeks, and you end up getting second, right? Out of in a class of 6, let's say, right? You get second place. You didn't get first, but you got second.
Still really good.
Still really good, but that person might be pissed, and they say, "Well, fuck, I didn't win first." And it's like, well, damn, you're lucky you got second because the person who took fourth has been doing this for 7 years, 4 more years than you have. They dieted for 16 weeks instead of 12 weeks, and they've just been in the trenches way longer than you. So you're actually lucky that you took second because the guy who took fourth actually outworked you and kind of, you know, has put in more time and effort than you have. And the guy who won first, maybe he's been doing this for a decade plus, you know. So again, you can't control that shit. You don't know who's going to show up. All you can control is what you do on a daily basis, and your attitude as you do what you do. So it's not always about what you do, it's also about how you do it, right? What's the attitude and the tone that you're kind of carrying? How do you carry yourself?
And level of effort. You gotta own that shit every day.
Absolutely.
It's not a game.
It's not a game.
Because the second you give it 50%, man, that person who's giving it 100%, they show up on show day, it's gonna show a difference.
Yeah.
But that's a great point. That's a great point. Remember, guys, it's important to think about the intrinsic factors as to why you're even going through with the contest prep in the first place. Are you doing it to impress that guy or girl? Or are you doing it for a silly little trophy? Because if you're not doing it for the right reasons, there will come a point in time in a contest prep where you suffer. And when you start to suffer, you have to lean on those intrinsic reasons as to why you're following through with it. But, you know, that's a great point, Chris. And to round off this discussion, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. I want to thank you for teaching me some new stuff. And, you know, I will be seeing you in a few weeks. Do you have anything you wanted to leave the audience with? Any products, projects?
No, nothing, man. I was just saying you're interviewing me very professionally. I was gonna say, I can't wait for you to be here. And hey, we could do an episode side by side, and we'll be sitting in the same area. So I'll see you soon, bro. I'm looking forward to it. Looking forward to you bringing the nasty. Yeah, and then for anybody listening, you guys can just, you know, if you're looking for more information on this, you could just go to schoolofgains.com. Gains is spelled with a Z. You can feel free to shoot me an email or a DM on social media if you have any questions. More than happy to help. And that's really it.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time, Chris. It was a pleasure having you on.
My pleasure, bro.
Talk soon.
Peace.
Talk soon, team. Bye-bye.